Hi food science students. Today we are going to be making a pastry, and this pastry is not just any pastry. This is probably one of the best things you can get from one of my favorite coffee shops up in Columbus called Fox in the Snow Cafe. And the pastry we are making today is a buttermilk biscuit. Now these are served at Fox in the Snow Cafe with a slathering of raspberry jam inside, and they are to die for, especially with a fresh latte or a cappuccino. And Fox in the Snow, sadly, they had to close during the COVID-19 pandemic. The stay-at-home order forced them to close their doors, but they will reopen. And you can bet that when they do, a buttermilk biscuit and a cappuccino is going to be one of the first things that I go up to get in Columbus. But we're going to make these at home today because Fox in the Snow shared their recipe with all of their loyal customers, and we are going to make this recipe for our lesson today. And this ties in perfectly with the unit that we are in right now, which is lipids or fats. And lipids or fats are very high energy compounds found in foods that contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in long chains. And they come from a variety of sources. So today we are working with this source, milk fats. We are going to be using butter, heavy whipping cream, and buttermilk all in our recipe for buttermilk biscuits. Now, milk fats obviously comes from milk. The name kind of suggests what it comes from. And these are fats that are used in lots of different food products. Lauric acids, these would be things like red palm oil. That's becoming a trendy kind of a fat to use for cooking. Vegetable butters like cocoa butter, coconut oil. You've probably seen that in the grocery store as well. It's a popular type of fat to cook with. It's very solid at room temperature, which is an unusual thing for vegetable butters. Usually they are liquid. Oleic, linoleic acids, those are things that come from corn oil. It's like what margarine would be. This is also going to be the category of fat where you're going to find things like olive oil. You're going to find avocados in this category as well. Linolenic acids are things like soybeans. So soybean oil that's used for cooking, vegetable oil, that's linolenic. Animal fats are fats that come from animal products, like the marbling in a steak. So those little white flecks of fat you see in a steak. You're also going to have lard in this category. And believe it or not, before Crisco was invented and became popular on the market, lard was the #1 type of fat to be used for cooking. So it might seem weird to talk about lard now because we don't use it much, but it was very popular and was the #1 cooking fat up until about the 1950s or 60s. Marine oils, these are the healthy omega-6 oils that you find in fish. So if you've ever heard somebody say you should eat fish to get healthy oils or to get healthy fats, or that fish is brain food, that's an old saying. That's because of the type of fat we find in fish. Those marine oils are very high in these omega-6 fatty acids. So marine oils are like fish oil, salmon, fatty fish. So these are the sources. Now, what differences we see in these types of lipids? They are going to be different in their terms of how they melt, solidify, smoke, and flash. So let's go through what these are real quick. Melting point, that's pretty obvious. That's the point at which they will melt, temperature-wise. Why is that important in our recipe today? Well, it's very important in our recipe today because the butter in the biscuits is going to melt when it goes into the oven. Now, the colder we can keep the butter, the longer we can keep it very, very cold, the less our biscuits will tend to shift or fall over. So we're actually going to do an experiment today where we are going to put some of our biscuits in the freezer before we put them in the oven. So we're going to take some of the biscuits we create from our recipe today and place them in the freezer for 15 minutes while the first batch of biscuits is baking. Then we're going to put them in the oven when the first batch of biscuits gets out. So we're going to take some biscuits that the butter has warmed up a little bit, straight in the oven, and then we're going to take some biscuits, put them in the freezer, allow that butter to solidify a little bit more, and then put them in the oven and see what different texture we get. That's the melting and solidifying lesson for today. Now, smoke and flash points are important for, not for baking, but for when you actually cook with oils on the stovetop or you deep fry with oils. Smoke refers to the point at which the oil will start to produce smoke. Flash is the point at which it will actually catch on fire. Now, if you've ever heard of somebody having a grease fire in the kitchen, it's because the fat they were working with caught on fire. It reached the flash point. Now, to deep fry food, you have to get the temperature of the food up to above 365 degrees. Usually 365 to 380 is a good temperature for deep frying. Now, you could never get water that high. No matter how much temperature you would try to, raise the temperature of water, it's going to start to evaporate and turn into steam at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. So water will only get to 212, but oil, you can get oil pretty hot. You can get oil like 450 degrees sometimes. And that's why it's such a good cooking medium, because you can cook things very, very quickly. Now, the ideal temperature, again, is that 365. And some oils will hold up better at that temperature than others. So olive oil, you don't want to deep fry in olive oil. That's not the best oil for deep frying. Peanut oil is fantastic for deep frying. So that's why peanut oil is used when people deep fry their turkeys at Thanksgiving, because they need an oil when they deep fry that turkey that will hold up and not flash or not smoke for a long time. Peanut oil will do that. So it's interesting when you start to look at these different sources of fats, like animal fats versus the linolenic acids versus the oleic linoleic acids. They will hold up at different temperatures and different points in terms of how you can use them. All right, so those are two really important lessons that we wanted to hit on the lipids, sources, and differences in their properties. Today, we are going to be working with heavy whipping cream. That's a milk fat. We're going to be working with butter. That's another milk fat. We're also going to be working with egg yolks. Egg yolks are also a source of fat. Now, the white of the egg is a source of protein, and that's our next unit after this one, but the yolks are where the fat is. So where's the butter? We see all these other ingredients out on the table. We have our flour, we have our baking powder, baking soda, we have sugar, we have salt. This is buttermilk, eggs, whipping cream. Where's the butter? We can't have buttermilk biscuits without butter. Oh, the butter is in the fridge. Why is the butter in the fridge?
So it won't melt.
That's
probably.
Right. We want to work with cold butter. So we want our butter to stay in the refrigerator for as long as possible till we're just ready to use it. So we're also going to be working with this butter with a food processor. And this is the knife that we're using to cut the butter. You can see it's very sharp. It's going to chop up and process our food quickly. All right, so what we want to do with our butter, now that we've got it out of the refrigerator, is we want to cut it into some chunks so that we can put it into the food processor and work with it. You can see it's pretty solid, so we want to work with this butter while it is as cold as possible. This is true anytime you are making a pie crust, anytime you're working with a butter in a pastry, you want to work with it when it's cold. So what this is going to do is like prolong the amount of time that that butter will be at that solidification point. All right, now, once we've got our butter in, we can go ahead and add our other dry ingredients that are important for our establishment of our biscuits. Now, this is our flour. We are adding 2 cups of flour. This is our baking powder. We are adding 1 tablespoon plus 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder. Baking soda, we are adding 1/2 teaspoon. Sugar, we are adding 1.5 teaspoons of sugar, so not a lot of sugar. This is our kosher salt. We are adding 1 tablespoon plus 1 teaspoon of kosher salt. So there's all of our first round of dry ingredients. We're going to put the lid on. Lock that into place. And it says we should do this until our pieces of butter are about the size of a nickel. That one's a little bit big, so we'll pulse just a couple more times here. All right, that should be good. So our next step in the process, after we've got our butter chopped in with our dry ingredients, is to take all of our stuff and put it into our big mixing bowl.
It stinks.
The food processor stinks? Yeah.
The dry ingredients.
No, it's the food processor that you're smelling there, honey. All right, so our next step is to go ahead in our big mixing bowl here. You can see our butter is in little chunks. That's perfect. We wanted them about the size of a nickel. All right, so now we are going to go ahead and add the rest of the flour. And that's another 3.5 cups of flour. So you use a total of 5.5 cups of flour for this recipe. But you don't put it all in at once because that would just be too much flour at once in the food processor. All right, so we're going to mix this in. All right, so you can still see our chunks of butter there. And now comes the buttermilk. So what we're going to do is pour all the buttermilk in at once. So we have 2 cups of buttermilk here. We're going to pour that all in at once. I'm going to take my scraper and scrape all the buttermilk out of here. Okay, and our instructions in our recipe say that what we're trying to do is create a shaggy dough. So we just want to stir this in.
It looks kind of like the dough we use to make our biscuits when we make chicken.
Ah, yeah, when we make our chicken and biscuit casserole. Yep, I'll be referring to a recipe that we've made for dinner before. All right, so I'm going to need to get a heavier spoon. So I'm going to grab this one over here, my heavy wooden spoon, to keep mixing. Now, earlier in class, back in probably January, we were learning about acids and bases in foods. And we learned that buttermilk is a food product that is oftentimes used when we want to get certain reactions in our food. So buttermilk is an acid. It's an acidic food. And remember, we are adding baking powder and baking soda. Soda is a base. So the buttermilk from our buttermilk that we've added to the biscuits is going to react with that baking soda, which is a base, and give us that desired acid-base reaction. Our baking powder that is in here. Remember, baking powder is where you've already mixed together a dry acid and a dry base. Those 2 leavening agents are going to give our biscuits their rise. That's what's going to let our biscuits fluff up. Okay, so we are at a point now where we are ready to turn our dough out onto our pastry board. So I'm going to go ahead and move our eggs and our cream over to the side. This is our pastry board. So what we're going to do now is we are going to turn the dough from the bowl out onto the pastry board and try to continue working it here. Okay.
Careful you don't spill it.
Yeah, I don't want to spill it. All right. So the goal was to mix up what was in the bowl so there was no more dry left at the bottom of the bowl. I might have left a little bit of dry. So again, before we got started here, we washed hands, we tied hair back. So we're just going to take our hands and kind of knead and work the rest of the dry into this dough. What we're going to do next, after we get this all kind of mixed together, is use a rolling pin to form this into our dough for cutting biscuits with our biscuit cutter. All right, so here's the last little bit of dry coming out of the bottom of our bowl. Scrape the sides with our scraper.
I tasted a tiny bit that was extra. It tasted good.
Right.
So I guess that the biscuits will taste great.
You think? Okay. So again, lots of butter here, and we don't want to work this too much because we don't want our butter to get warm. So you want to try to work quickly when you have a pastry, because you don't want your butter to get too warm and get your dough to become too soft. Then it gets really hard to work with. So this is one of the reasons why pie crust, sometimes you'll actually make your pie crust for something like a pumpkin pie in advance and put the pie crust in the refrigerator so that it will chill and maintain its shape when you cook it. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna follow the instructions given to take our rolling pin, and we're gonna just roll this out into a rectangle as best we can. All right, and then what we're gonna do is take our dough. Might need to get a little bit of flour to flour my board here. Okay, so we're going to take our flour, put some flour on our rolling pin. All right, and then we're going to take our dough and we're going to fold it. It says to do what's called a tri-fold. So we're going to take our dough and we're going to fold this side in and then this side on top. And then from there, we're going to continue to roll it out. We're going to do this 3 times. So we're going to take this side in and this side over and then roll it out. See how we're doing this?
It looked like a burrito before you rolled it out.
Yeah, and this is what's going to give our dough its layers. All right, so this will be our last roll out here. Okay. And at this point, we should be ready to start cutting biscuits. Okay, so we're going to come right back and show you how we're going to cut biscuits. Okay, so we've gone ahead and rolled out our biscuit dough and cut out the first batch of biscuits that are going to go into the oven. But before we put them in the oven, we are going to put an egg cream mixture over top of them. And to do this, we are going to need to separate our eggs. So I want to show you how to separate an egg. So we're going to begin by cracking the egg. And what we're going to try to do is hold the 2 shell sides so that we split the yolk away from the white. All right, so you can buy little like egg separator tools in kitchen gadget stores and stuff like that, but you really don't need that. You can just do this by splitting the egg in half and then using the 2 halves of the egg. Whoops, here I say that and then I messed up this one to split the yolk. All right, so we've got our 2 yolks in there. We've got our whites in here with a little tiny bit of yolk that we can use later to make an egg white omelet or something like that. So we're going to take this mixture and we're going to whisk it with a fork. And this is going to go as a coating over top of our biscuits. All right, so we're going to be using a brush. So I've got a little biscuit brush right here that we're going to be using.
A biscuit brush?
A basting brush, you could say. And we're just going to lightly coat the biscuits with this mixture.
It looks like a paintbrush.
It does. So if you don't have one of these at home, you could just take a spoon and just spoon a little bit of this around the biscuits and kind of like brush it on there with a paper towel or something else that you have in the kitchen, I'm sure. But this is a handy tool to have because this is what you can use when you barbecue, to put barbecue sauce on things. You can use this to put like little bits of, like you said, this kind of wash on here. You can take this and use it to sprinkle like mixtures of spices on cookies and things like that. So we're just going to take the edges of the biscuits, wrap it around with this mixture, and it's ready to go in the oven. So these are going to bake for 30 to 35 minutes at 375. So we're going to start our timer. And we're going to set it for 30 and then check on them at that point to see how they look. Now, the rest of this dough, what we're going to do with it, same thing. We're going to do our little folds. We're going to roll the dough back out. And these are going to be our biscuits that go in the refrigerator to cool. And we're going to determine, or sorry, not the refrigerator, the freezer to cool. So we're going to determine what differences we get when we refrigerate, or sorry, when we freeze the biscuits before we put them in the oven versus when we just take them straight from the cutting board and put them in the oven.
That looks like cookie or cake dough.
So these are going to be the biscuits that go in the refrigerator. Sorry, in the freezer. I keep saying fridge.
Mommy, it's the freezer.
It's the freezer. So 1, 2.
2.
Let's see if I can get a third one from right here. 3. Now, if you don't have a biscuit cutter at home, a couple of other little tools that you could use to make your biscuits and cut them out. You could use a can with both ends open. So you could take a can opener and just take a soup can and open both ends, and there's your biscuit cutter. You can also use a glass. You could use
a knife.
You could use a knife and just cut them into squares. That's another nifty way to make your biscuits.
Or you could even use cookie cutters, right?
You could use cookie cutters. If you have cookie cutters that are open at the top, you could do that. So biscuit cutters are great, but you don't need to feel like that's a deal breaker if you don't have those at home. You can use lots of other creative ways to cut your biscuits. Okay, so we're going to take this last little bit of dough and kind of pat it.
Make one more biscuit.
Yep. And one of the pieces of advice I got on this is that you don't want to twist your biscuit cutter. Your biscuit cutter is getting kind of sticky, so I'm going to coat it with some flour here to make it go through the dough a little easier. Okay, clean it off. All right. There's big biscuit number 4. And so we just got this last little bit of dough here. This is where we're going to probably use our tiny biscuit cutter that we have.
Make tiny biscuits.
Yeah, we have a couple of tiny biscuit cutters.
Like some bite-sized biscuits?
Mm-hmm. So let's see what we get here.
Oh, you can make one last.
One last big one.
Then we'll have to make some tinies.
We'll have to make some tinies, yep.
Make sure the biscuits don't stick together.
Yeah.
Because if they did.
Here's Aubrey's baby biscuit cutter.
Baby biscuit.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going to make miniature biscuits with the baby biscuit cutter.
Actually, we could just do this and form it into one big biscuit. Let's do that.
All
right, so these are going to go in the freezer. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of plastic covering.
I wanted some baby biscuits. That's okay.
Plastic covering here, and these are going to go in the outside freezer. So while this first batch is baking, and they have 26 more minutes, these biscuits are going to go down here in the freezer. There's some space for them. And what that's going to do is it's going to further solidify our butter that has warmed up as we've been cooking with it and preparing the recipe today. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the kitchen, wait for this first batch of biscuits to come out, and then we're going to compare the looks of the two biscuits, the ones that went straight in the oven, straight from the countertop, to the ones that went into the freezer, and that's going to show you the impact of melting and solidification points on our fats. Okay, our timer just went off for the first batch of biscuits. So here's the big moment of truth. How are they going to look? Oh, tipsy, right? Look at what happened to those biscuits. They look beautiful and fluffy, but they're tipsy. What has happened? They've kind of split apart at their layers. Look at that. Why did this happen? Well, I'll tell you why it happened. It happened because our butter got too warm. And this is one of the tricks that Fox in the Snow kind of shared with some of their fans as they were watching how people were getting these biscuits made out there. They were seeing pictures of fallen biscuits, of tipsy biscuits, of biscuits that didn't quite look just right. And they wondered, like, what's happening? What am I doing wrong? Well, it's all about the temperature of the butter. So what we're going to do with biscuit batch number 2 is we're going to put them on a baking sheet. And we're going to pop them in the oven. But remember, they've been in the freezer for about 30 minutes now. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're just going to pick up the whole parchment sheet, move these guys over, and just space them out a little bit. And we're going to see if we get some difference here. All right, so same thing, timer. I'm going to set it for 30 minutes. And then we'll see if this looks different. Now, there's one last little step that we are going to do with these biscuits, and that is we're going to coat them with some honey butter. So we're going to take a stick of butter, and we're going to take a cup of honey and melt it together, and then we're going to just coat the outside of these biscuits with that honey butter and sprinkle a little bit of sea salt on top of them. But before we get to that, I wanted to share with you some of the main points of today's lesson. So the main points that we had for today's lesson is that there are different sources of fats. So here in my kitchen at home, and I've got lots of these different sources of fats. I've got some olive oil. I love cooking with and using dairy fats, milk fats. I put half and half in my coffee every morning. So milk fats are a type of fat. We also have animal fats. That's the fat that was in the egg yolks. Remember we made that egg yolk mixture? Oh my gosh, I forgot to coat these guys. That reminds me, I need to take them out and coat them with our egg yolk mixture. I'm glad I said something. So we've got animal fats. We've also got fats that come from cocoa butters, vegetable butters. So we've got some coconut oil. We're going to be using that coconut oil actually in a lesson to teach you guys how to make your own homemade lip balm. So stay tuned. We're going to do a lesson on that. We also see where we can get fats from things like soybeans, and we can get fats from corn, and we use those vegetable fats to make things like vegetable oil. Peanut oil is a great oil for cooking deep frying turkeys at Thanksgiving. And we have those marine oils, those fish oils, things that come from fatty fish like salmon. And those are very, very high in what we call omega-9, omega fatty acids, omega-3s, omega-6, omega-9 fatty acids that are very, very good for our health. All right, back in the oven with these. So we learned about different sources of fat. And we also learned that those different sources of fat have different properties. For example, my olive oil, you can hear it, that's liquid. Okay, I can pour this out. This is a liquid. On the other hand, my butter is solid. Now they're both kept at the same spot, right here next to the oven, right there at room temperature. The difference is that the butter has a higher amount of carbon atoms attached to its chain. The more carbon atoms that are in an acid that forms the fat, the more solid the fat will be at room temperature. So a fat that would have even more carbon than this is the fat that's on the side of a steak. So if you ever get a steak or a pork chop or a lamb chop and you have that fat on the outside, that fat that you sometimes trim, or that marbling in the middle, that is animal fat, and that's very high in carbon. It has what's called stearic acid in it. It has a lot of carbon, like 18 carbon atoms attached to its chain of hydrogen. So it's going to be even more solid at room temperature. So solidification and liquefaction points of different fats determined by the amount of carbon in them also can shape how we use that fat in cooking. For example, you wouldn't want to use animal fat in a salad dressing. Like, you're going to pour it out and it's just going to be chunky. That's not going to be very good. But you would use something like olive oil or vegetable oil in a salad dressing, and it would pour out really nicely on top of your spinach salad. So it just shows you how these fats make such different, I guess, have such different applications depending on their different properties, their solidification points, their smoke points, their flash points, and their melting points. So these are all these cool different properties of fats that we learned about in this lesson. We also, in this lesson, besides the sources of fat and the properties of fat, we saw how we can manipulate those properties. So these biscuits tipped over because the fat got a little too warm, the butter got a little too warm. Those biscuits probably will not tip as much. We'll put a picture and we'll do a comparison of the two later, but we can manipulate those properties. Something interesting, a lot of times salad dressings would not be liquid, it would not be pourable. I'm going to get one here. In the refrigerator, if we didn't somehow manipulate them a little bit. So some of these oils that we use in salad dressing, some of the vegetable oils, the olive oils, they would actually solidify if we just stuck them in the refrigerator at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. But we manipulate those oils. We add some different things to them to get them to not solidify and not set up in the refrigerator, so that way when we pull them out and they're cold, we can pour them right on our salads. We don't have to warm up our salad dressings to make those things happen. So it's interesting how scientists and food scientists can do things to foods to kind of change how those oils and how those fats, how those lipids, that category that we call all those fatty food ingredients, those lipids perform. So again, we saw that there's differences in their sources, there's differences in their properties. Fats are very misunderstood and very miscalculated ingredient. A lot of people think negative things when they hear the word lipid or they hear the word fat. And that's just not true. Science is starting now to prove that fat is so important in so many ways to our health. Fat helps to feed our brain. Fat helps to form hormones. Fat is so important in our diet, and we cut out fat as much as we can sometimes because we have this negative image of fat. Or we have this image that's a little bit shifted the other way where we think, oh, all kinds of fat's really good, like keto. Somewhere in the middle is actually probably more realistically where we should be in terms of how much fat we eat. So there's lots of great articles from lots of good academic sources out there if you are curious about digging deeper into the importance of having fat in your diet. One thing that we do know for sure, a 100% low-fat, hugely low-fat diet is not the way to go, especially if you are young. You guys that are watching this, you my students, you're teenagers, to cut fat out of your diet right now at this stage in your lives would be a very detrimental thing. Your bodies need fat to help keep you healthy and to help form the hormones that you need for growth. You're at a very important stage in your life right now, and so to completely cut out fat would be a bad idea. I was a teenager in the 90s when the low-fat diet trends were everywhere. So I made the mistake probably when I was growing up in high school of cutting out way too much fat. I would just try to like nanometer cut my fat down to just a few grams a day. And that's not healthy and that's not good. So I hope when you guys kind of go out there and look that you'll remember to look at academic sources, look at reliable sources, sources from scientific journals and publications and medical journals and publications to get your information about fat and really kind of think critically about that. That's my challenge for you this week, is to kind of research fat and research the importance of having that in your diet. All right, so you've learned how we use it in cooking. We'll show you the comparison of the two biscuits here in a bit, and that's the lesson on fat for this week.